ain't the weather. That's death approaching.
They're tearing through everyone's home.
We can last the month.
Hello and welcome to Movie
Welcome to Movie Smash, the podcast that looks at comic book movies that you may or may not remember. If you're the type of person that enjoys talking about hidden gems or likes to tear old movies apart, this is the place for you. And with that, why don't we get started today? My name is, I'm your host, one of your hosts, Chris Roberts. I'm the founder of Off Panel Creations, a place where we fuse nerd culture with furniture. With me today, I've got Jeremy Parmentier.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Parmentier. I'm one of the hosts of the Retrovaniacs podcast, but I also love comics and movies, so I'm going to do this as well.
And Fergel.
I'm Fergel Amayo, owner of Gotham Knight Comics, located in Livonia, Michigan at 37661. We are the Nerd Haven, and I am your comic historian and movie aficionado.
So our movie today is 2007's 30 Days a Night, starring Josh Hartnett, Melissa George, and it's directed by David Slade, who was known before that for Hard Candy and a ton of music videos. But before we jump into the movie, why don't we just share a little bit on sort of your previous history with either did you see it in the theaters or did you know anything about this at all?
I definitely saw this in the theater. Now, at the time, I guarantee you, if I knew it was a comic book movie, it was only through friends of mine that were comic guys. Again, I used to work at a comic shop 5 or so years before this movie came out, but I still hang out with, and at that time definitely hung out with, all those guys. So I'm sure that they were like, oh, you know, this was a comic, right? And I was like, I don't care. This looks like a rad horror movie. So I definitely saw this in the theaters. At that point, I didn't even know it was a comic. I now do know that it's a comic, but I still have not really read it. So I still went into this one kind of as the idea of I enjoy horror movies. So let's see if this one holds up that way. Hopefully you guys are more familiar with the comic material.
I did see the movie. I did read the book. I've kind of been very familiar with it. It's got incredible source material. The book is actually, it kind of dives a little deeper into the characters, and it actually made one of the co-authors' careers, and it sort of got the other one off the ground. He's made a couple of interesting pieces after that. But yeah, it's a pretty cool book. It's a pretty cool comic book, especially out of IDW.
So for me, to be very frank, I did not know this was a comic book movie. Not at all. In fact, I didn't know that until we started talking about it. Actually, looking back around that time period, this is going to sound weird, but I thought this was a zombie movie. So when it came out, I was not into my zombie phase of horror movies. I was tired of it. 28 Days, I was finished. I'd seen enough. They were all the same at that point to me. So I honestly thought this was a zombie movie until we watched this movie. So I was pleasantly surprised, let's put it that way.
Oh, so this was the first time you've seen this movie?
Yes, this is the first time I've seen it. I have, up until I bought the DVD for this movie, for this podcast, I had not seen this thing. And it was a good $5 spend.
Because all you paid for was $5?
Yeah, $5 for my extended cut with the commentary, like always. So, Fergel, because Jeremy and I did not know this was a comic book, can you tell us a little bit of sort of back history about this comic? Anything you know about it?
Yeah, so it's written by Steve Niles and I want to make sure I get the name, Ben Templesmith. So the big important thing is that Steve Niles was a bit of an unknown author. He had tried to get published a couple times on comic books, couldn't make it happen. And actually, he wrote this script, he couldn't get it shopped. And even though he couldn't make a lot of comic books, he decided he eventually got this thing made as a comic, and it became a cult hit. And immediately, like, it was made in 2002, and so between 2002 and 2007, that's a short period of time usually to pick up on a book. So it jumped up and it got picked up. And interesting enough, Steve's made some pretty interesting follow-up stories. Ben Templesmith has worked on Legion, some other shows outside of that, American Horror Story, and this movie has actually spawned a ton of sequels. They're, kind of direct to videos, but there's like 3 sequels that follow behind it. But yeah, interesting story, very different take on a vampire story. The only thing comparable would be like Near Dark. That would be, or maybe even like Lost Boys, maybe in some regards, but I'd say closer to Near Dark, very very really dark kind of vampire story, very much off the beaten path.
Yeah, I think you hit it. Really was a non-vampire vampire story. But yeah, I haven't read the book yet. I might go pick it up. Why don't we jump into the movie? So plot-wise, to sum it up really quickly, this takes place in, I think it's Alaska's most northern city of Barrow, which is a real place, by the way. And once a year, it experiences about 30 days of night. And then during that time period, a gang of vampires decides to show up, tries to wipe out the town in that 30-day period before the sun comes back up. And that's really about what happens on sort of the higher level of that movie. But there's a lot that happens in that movie, of course. I want to spend a little time on the characters, actually, because I think they were done a disservice. There were a lot of good characters in there with a lot of interesting stories, but I don't think it really came to the surface too much.
Well, the biggest thing for me is that you gave a nice overview synopsis, but there's so much more. The comic, that's where they were very faithful to the source material, but because the way the movie is made, I think the director of that movie decided to focus on the bloodiness of it, which is awesome, but kind of missed out on why the vampires used a certain language, why they all followed the one guy, what the other guy's story is, and sort of the protagonist and antagonist. There's an interesting tension, and I think they kind of threw things off for a beaten path, even though it was a good path with the stranger. Like Ben Foster, he could have been used so much better because he was made just for the movie.
The end of that stranger was actually one interesting for you to pick up too. Like I said, I watch this on a regular way, regular watching of it. Then I watch it with a commentary, which had the producer on it, the two main actors. And they were talking about Ben, and how he was really sort of the Reinfeldt character for the vampires, right? The human is trying to become a vampire who is going to be beaten down by them. But during the opening shots, you see him walking across that snow wasteland, if you would. Strange little fact: the guy shoves snow in his pants just to feel that cold, to look that bad.
I don't think he probably needed that help. They were, as long as it was covered in actual snow, he probably didn't need that extra thing. But that's fine, because he looked like a guy who'd been stuck out on the snow for a while. Now, I didn't know, because again, I haven't read this comic. So does the comic, like as it was originally done, I'm assuming it came out as like a series as opposed to like an endless book, right? So did this story mainly contain what was in the original book? Because I know there's been books after this and sequels and such.
There are lots of sequels. I mean, that's the book was supposed to, again, the book carries a little bit of the backstory and then it progresses directly into Barrow. So it does have a little bit of the backstory because you got to like a character and know a character. So you got to understand how they arrived at Barrow, and so the book gives you a little bit more backstory. So if you think of like Interview with the Vampire, and they try to go in that second movie or whatever, and they try to talk about, I don't know, whatever movie, they try to talk about the background of vampires, you get a little bit more vampire background, because then you start to understand like who that dude is and why it matters, and why what happens after that, and sort of and then you get a little bit more of an understanding between the two people who are there, kind of the protagonists, if you will, and you get kind of that has an interest, and they develop that a little bit more in the story. But yeah, it's pretty faithful, more than most.
So in the book, does it start with, because this movie starts with after you see kind of the flashback of the stranger, the main character, Evan, and the other police officers find this like hole in the snow that's full of burned up and ruined cell phones, so that people, essentially, you don't know at the time, but you kind of get a clue, like, why would they have burned all these cell phones? And it's so that the stranger would have come to town, stole these cell phones and other ways to communicate, and blocked off this town even more from the rest of the world than it normally is. I mean, Barrow really is, if you look on a map, I mean, when we're saying it's the most northern city in Alaska, it's the most northern city in the United States, and it's one of the most northern cities in the entire world. It's right up by the Arctic Circle. It's way, way away from everything else. The only way to get there effectively is a plane. Otherwise, yes, there are some kind of roads and such, but not really. And during the winters in Alaska, a lot of this stuff is totally blocked off, and the only way to get there is flights that are only good when the weather's good. So the 30 days of night that Chris talked about, I don't think, if you didn't do the research ahead of time and you didn't understand what that is, basically they're so far north that and actually it's longer than 30 days in real life, but for a chunk of the time, the sun does not come up fully on that side of the world. They're on the opposite side of the world completely from the sun entirely for like a month and a half. And so it's yes, there are varying degrees of night, but it never is fully sunny. And so, since these are vampires and they're going to be able to do whatever they want to do to this town for this 30 days, they don't have to worry about the sun, because while these vampires aren't standard movie vampires, they're not like they don't turn into a bat or all this other stuff. They don't have all the goofy vampire stuff. I'm not a big vampire fan in general, but I think these vampires are actually really cool. They're more feral. They're more realistic, I guess, for vampires. But they do have the effect where the sun will hurt them. And you know, it's not ruining the movie. That's why they are doing this during this block of 30 Days of Night. So, like, without the cell phones and other stuff, I mean, how does the idea that someone came earlier before the rest of the clan or brood or whatever they're called show up, does that happen in the comics, or do they just kind of show up once night?
That's where the differences in the book come into play. So in the book or in the comic, they more focus on the fact that vampires have been around for centuries. And that there are clans of them, and that leader is challenging. Well, he's trying to find a new feeding ground for the clan. And so the stranger, there really isn't so much the cell phones. That is definitely something you see in the book, because obviously they're trying to eliminate that. They go through some of the pages of that. It's much more art. That's the other part about it, is that this is probably one of more IDW's, one of more beautiful books. I mean, it's much more painted characters. So you do see a little bit, you do see that. But as I said, the stranger was drawn into the movie. In the comic, you got them kind of looking, and this guy trying to scout out a new place. And technically, he went against the head of vampire in attacking this community. The vampire was like, the head vampire in the book was like, look for it. That's cool. Take what you need, but do not expose us because you're an idiot. And unfortunately, this guy, gets hungry or whatever, and inadvertently doing so comes across. And as I said, that's where the sheriff, and that's where Eben and Stella, when without giving away in the movie, it makes for very long enemies. That's why, the thing in the end of the movie where you sort of see Stella's eyes, it sort of led to the sequels. But there's some enemies, there's some story that goes on. That was how that comic was to be written. That's why there were a couple follow-up books from that, because while it was initially 3 issues, it followed afterwards.
It's like funny you talk about that. When I, on my second rewatch the movie, that I didn't pay attention to the first time was how the character, the stranger, you see him walking this wasteland. In the distance, you see like a ship, right? And I'm assuming that's where the vampires came from. Fergel, is that in the book?
Yes, it is. But they can also walk. So in this particular case, they did come by ship. But again, the idea is that they were not supposed to really attack the town. But they did anyway. And he had planned anyways. That's why he took a group of people with him. But what was also missed was how old that particular vampire was. Because what we don't understand is like how old he actually is. Because they're again sex, right? And that guy is a very old. I mean, we're talking multiple hundreds of years old.
Jeremy, you kind of touched on it, how the vampires are more like a feral type of being versus like your shiny vampire, if you would.
Yeah, they're not Twilight vampires.
Yeah, so why don't we talk a little about sort of the differences of these vampires? Because like I said, I thought this movie, from all the trailers, was a zombie movie until I actually saw this thing. And so what sort of difference do you see between this and like your traditional kind of vampire? What made them stand out to you?
Well, for me, normally a vampire movie is one vampire maybe, and maybe there's some others that will people that will kind of follow that vampire, but really most vampire movies are about one vampire. That's kind of the focus of the movie. This instead, yes, there's still the vampire that's leading them all, but really they still work like if they were a tribe of people, right? So there's tons of vampires. The other thing is that, like, again, they don't turn into bats. They don't. They do speak another language in the movie. They do translate some of it when it makes sense to do so, and they do speak some English when it's like to be threatening. They can use some guttural English words here and there. But generally, I liked it more. It made them seem more like they were. I mean, not quite aliens, but definitely like a force that did seem ancient, or from somewhere in Russia or Eastern Europe, or some of these areas where you wouldn't quite know the dialect. It sounds familiar, but not quite sure what it's supposed to be. And The other part that I liked with these vampires is they swarm. They swarm like zombies do. So it's not, yes, there is some one-on-one fights, but most of the time it's like once one of them hits, they make a call and they all kind of show up out of the woodwork and go nuts and start killing everybody. There's a couple scenes that are these aerial views of when the vampires finally like descend on the town. And you could have replaced them with zombies there and it would have worked, but I like this more because they don't have the mindless piece of the zombie, right? Zombies just kind of swarm towards whatever the next thing to eat is, and then they walk around aimlessly till they don't know what to do, or they lay on the ground till people show up. Like this, these are smart thinking, swarming vampires. It's again, I'm not a big vampire fan because I think a lot of the time the like romantic vampire I'm not a fan of. But these are much more animalistic and in my opinion realistic vampires, right? The other thing is that the normally in vampire movies, if you're bit by a vampire, you become one, and that does kind of happen, but it's almost like, or they just eat them. Like there's a window where if you leave them alive at all, they could turn. Otherwise, you just eat them, and that's the end. Like most vampire movies, they don't feed on people to death. They normally just use them to feed, and then they become their slaves or whatever. In these cases, they're just flat out treating like humans like livestock.
Big plot hole in this particular movie. They ate all they're looking to eat their livestock so quickly. That's the drawback, and that's the one thing that's a little bit different. The other in the comic, they extend it out a little bit, so they don't all try to. It's like I was reading someone because I always when I want to do these, I like to just prep up and read some of the audience reviews, or not audience, but critiquers, if you will, of the movie. And one of the things that was interesting about the critique of this movie was that because the material is a little bit different. Again, the story in the comic, it's a 3-issue arc, but they do make that issue work over that 30 days because it's near the end of that 30 days that Eben does what he does and goes the route he goes. But in this one, it seems like they were hungry. It was a buffet and they were on it, man.
Yes.
You got to kick these folks out if they went to a Sweeten House or a Golden Corral. They might have used it all up too quick.
Yeah, whenever I watch movies with like a supernatural feel to it, like a zombie movie, a vampire movie, what have you, I try to figure out the rules on it. And it was an interesting take on the sort of the rules of the vampire. The thing I struggled with was I did like the feralness of it too. In fact, I've been playing Jurassic World Evolution on the side, just like a simulator for Jurassic World. It's important. There's a whole section with velociraptors. They reminded me of like a swarm of velociraptors at times, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're fast and they come in groups, and it's terrifying.
Exactly, and they kind of like a bird call at times too.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. I think the best thing about the way they looked, and this is the part that the secondary language was nice. Again, a bit of a touch from the comic book. It was nice. I like the fact that they're, again, they made their faces look slightly less than human. But I think, again, from a CG perspective, what was really impressive was less the faces and more just how they really put a lot of really extra effort on blood. They went after folks. Like, it's a bloody movie. I mean, this is not a movie for the faint of heart. You're watching Blade for something completely different. You're watching this and you're like, wow, they are not sparing the horse on this one.
Fun fact, the blood in this was either flavored strawberry or spearmint.
Oh, spearmint blood. That's a nice touch. Yeah. No, this is treated more like a horror movie. I mean, Blade, when you watch Blade or something that's a more action-oriented vampire movie, a lot of the time, those end up being over the top, over the top comic booky kind of stuff, which is not a negative. It is a comic book. But this, I mean, honestly, if I wouldn't have known it was a comic book a little bit, and now doing it for this podcast about comic books that are movies, this still just seems to me like a straight up horror movie, which is not a bad thing because there's plenty of straight up horror comic books. But the violence level and the level to detail on the effects is very much a high quality horror movie level of effects.
Well, you mentioned the effects. This movie is 16 years old at this point, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Do the effects hold up for you?
I'm going to say yes. I mean, the vampires' faces maybe a little bit, you can kind of tell there's a little bit of, again, that's, except for Marlowe. So the main vampire, I think they put the effort on the actor who played the main vampire.
Yes.
And by the way, his name is Marlowe. So that's what makes him so unique. His name, they actually named him. So that's why it's kind of like when you guys are, we're talking about vampires and we're talking about the movie, you don't get to really, the character dive gets them. And that's, I think, the one always going to be a difference until they get great comic adaptations. You don't get some of the backstory, but Marlowe is the main vampire. He looks like they put the prosthetics on him. The rest of them, the face is a little off, but blood and guts, oh yeah, this will hold up today.
Yeah, they are practical effects for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of like early-ish, not early, but there's CG in this, but it's not. It's still a lot of practical blood effects and stuff.
Yeah, and you mentioned the name of the vampires. It's kind of a weird fact, but they actually named every single vampire in that movie. It's just not brought up in the movie. They did that. They did that for payment-wise. Just a little fact for you. In fact,
oh really?
Yeah, in fact,
I didn't know that. That must be a commentary.
Yeah, exactly. This is all in commentary. In fact, Marlowe is he's the only actor of all the vampires. Everyone else are stunt doubles that got the job as a stunt double.
That explains a lot.
Yeah. Now this movie is just under 2 hours. It's I think an hour and 53. Pacing, that's long for a horror movie. So pacing wise, how do you guys feel about that?
I mean, there are points in the movie. I watched it twice just to prep up for this. The first time I watched it through, you get to enjoy it. You get to. I mean, I think the beginning gets really good. The middle is a little bit slow. It gets slower, and then it speeds back up. I think that's how it kind of looks in the movie. I think that's the part, because again, it starts off like a little bit, and then it's like bam, and then it gets a little slow, and then like okay, then the end when they force the confrontations, that's where it was really cool.
I think for a horror movie, it's paced really well. I don't think it's as good as The Thing, but as far as a similar movie, kind of based in the Arctic, where it does kind of have these slow periods, but they're slow periods, they're menacing periods, and there's a lot of background in this as Fergel said that the comic books really fill in. I think they tried really hard to add, and again, I don't know what the backstory and such is in the comics, but they tried to add those things in here. Like, I know that it's supposed to be 30 days because the title of the movie is 30 Days of Night, and thankfully it doesn't do this thing where like every few minutes at the bottom of the screen it's like day 1, day 2, day 3, because that would be kind of boring as well. I didn't realize watching this, other than the fact that it's titled as 30 days. It feels like it's more like 48 hours of night, even though it's clearly supposed to be a month. I think that's the pacing problem is not really, I don't think it's paced badly for enjoying a movie. I never got bored with this. On the second watch, I fully enjoyed watching it to try to see if there's other like connecting things I missed before. I think it's just it would have been paced better as a 6 or 7 episode miniseries, because then you could actually dig more into the background. Much like the more recent Last of Us HBO show they did, that was paced based on a video game, so it has another source that was coming from something else. But if that would have been tried to done as a 2-hour movie, there would be a whole lot of connections that weren't made. And that was, you mentioned the characters and how there's a lot of really good characters, but other than a few people, you really don't get to know much about them. I think if you had that extra time, a lot of the things in this movie that are supposed to have kind of a real emotional hit that didn't hit for me. I mean, they hit and you were like, oh, that's sad. But that's not what they were aiming for. They weren't aiming for, oh, that's sad. You were supposed to feel like, oh man, I can't believe that happened to this guy. Or I can't believe this guy, make this sacrifice for the group, or whatever the thing that's going to happen to these different characters. Aside from one notable one, everybody else, I kind of felt like it was just like, yeah, sure, that's one more person gone. Like, I don't know. It wasn't all the time you'd need to get connection to these characters, I think was lacking. But it's not the fault of the movie. It's hard to cram that in to an hour and a half, or even an hour, or even 2 hours.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because it reminded me of like, I felt like it was an iceberg. You know what I mean? Like, we saw the surface level of all the things going on, but there was obviously a lot more to it. They just didn't have the time to talk about it or show it, if you know what I mean. There's a scene where this young woman is walking out, this young girl, like she's probably like 10 or 12, covered in blood, right? And there was a whole scene cut from the movie of where her family hid in the walls of their house for a week. Like in between the walls, right? Like, imagine the terror of that story, and then why that it's emotional. If you know the scene I'm talking about, where she's wandering down the street aimlessly.
Yeah.
In the movie, she just sort of shows up. Right? So there's all this backstory and all this lore that, having not read the comic, I wish I had time to find it. But I understand 2 hours is a long time for a movie, and I think a miniseries probably would have worked best. Overall, guys, how did you feel about this movie?
I liked it. I thought, again, thinking about everything that you guys have talked about, and like some of the missing scenes, like any movie, when you get some of those extra scenes, you can kind of fill in. Like, it would have been really terrifying to hear her family, or just kind of seeing her family watching their daughter get, because they held that girl out as bait to try and pull the rest of the vampires out, or pull the rest of the town folk out. I thought that would have been terrifying. I thought the fight at the end, I thought, first off, having Josh Hartnett, because when they got this movie made, remember, every studio denied this movie before, because this was originally when Stephen Niles wrote this, he wrote this as a script. So what's a fun fact about this, which I'm not sure was in your commentary, was when he started this process, this wasn't a comic. He wrote this movie and shopped it everywhere for 2 years, and no one would buy it. So he basically went back to the drawing board, rewrote it as a comic book. IDW, he sent it to the list of all the rejected scripts. for this comic, and he sent it to IDW, and they published it. So I mean, and then it jumped off from there. Right? It's a way of kind of interesting backstory, how you run through. So again, good movie. I think are there parts where it could be better? Yeah, but I think it's a great movie.
Yeah, funny you mentioned that. I did hear about that. About it was originally a screenplay that became a comic that then became a screenplay. And in fact, Josh only took the role because the writer had filmed what he thought the vampire should look like and showed him that test footage. He flew out to his house in like Montana or something like that and showed it. Went to his house to show him the footage. And once he saw it, he's like, "I'm in. I don't care what the script says. I'm in."
I think this movie on its own, without the source material, is solid. This is a great horror movie. I enjoyed watching it multiple times for this podcast. I watched it when it was new, and I had very positive memories of the movie. I couldn't remember a ton about like the intricacies of the plot, but I do generally like it's in this town in Alaska. These vampires come. It's the police officer and like everyone in town kind of gathering together to try to survive. And I kind of even totally forgot the actual ending of the movie, which is probably more of a statement on how inebriated I was when I watched it the first time in the movie theater. But when I watched it again here, like I fully enjoyed this experience. It doesn't feel too long for a horror movie. And that's saying a lot because a lot of horror movies, if you don't have a lot of story to it, it does get very boring. You need a movie that has, like the original Halloween, movies that have these long periods where it just builds up tension. And this has that when they're trying to constantly hide. I think they actually could have used some more of that, but I think that would have drawn this out a little longer. But I think this is on its own a great movie, and I am interested in reading the comics. Now, I would also say I don't think it needs. Let's say there were no. I know Fergel already said there were sequels, and then there's more comics based on this, or whatever. As a standalone, if this, while it was totally set for place where you're like, I'd like to know more, it didn't need more. It's a good self-contained box of a story where you leave the movie and you're like, that was fun. I enjoyed that, and I actually did feel like the ending hits really well. I think that's one thing this movie does well. But I am interested in knowing where these vampires came from or a little more about their universe. But I'm kind of glad that as a standalone movie, you didn't need it. You just knew these things showed up. They clearly have been around for a while. There's a line in the movie, I think, where Marlowe says something like, it took centuries to get humans to believe we were make-believe. Let's raise the town to the ground to make sure that no one has any proof that we were ever here. Like, I love that. That's a little, I'm sure that's
the whole scene.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to bring it up, but that's the scene where you get to know the head vampire, Vincent. That's where really we start interjecting further backwards and going, yep, they're at odds with each other. That's who that guy is, and that's where it hints at the terrifying nature of these vampires.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I didn't need more information. I wanted more, and I'm glad to find out that I can pick up these comics and get a little more information or see what happens. I know that there was a prequel series and a sequel series and a sequel movie and all this other stuff. Fine, but I think I'm going to go right to the comics to see where else this goes because, while I did read some slight reviews on the prequel, sequel, and the sequel movie, they were all much lower budget than this. This actually had a fairly good, for a horror movie, this had a great budget, something like $35 million, and it made $75 or $80 million in the theaters, which is not bad for a horror movie at all. That's considered a success most places, so I'm not surprised that they did more. But everything after this had a much lower budget. So this was a good standalone thing. I'm interested in finding out more, though.
No, I agree with both you guys. I spent $5 on this movie. It was a good $5. It was. I'm not complaining about it whatsoever. So we're going to get the reviews later on, of course, but I think it's solid. It's a solid movie. So I guess it brings up the question: would you recommend this to somebody?
I would. I think it's again. If you're going to put for there's so many vampire movies, and a lot of them got twisted because of that Twilight movie. So if you're going to put this in what I like to call the horrifying vampire movie camp, this squarely belongs in it. And that's why it's almost impossible to mention this without another comic book, Near Dark, which is probably, these guys belong right next to each other in terms of amazing vampire movies that you would clearly want to see.
Yeah, Near Dark's a good pick. This is definitely one I'd recommend because again, it's not a classic, Hammer vampire movie, but it's also not sparkly Twilight vampires. This has a good menacing horror movie vampire feel. Now, I would say I only recommend it to people who want to watch horror movies. If you were like, I really want to watch a comic book movie that was, a comic book that was turned into a movie, I don't know if I'd say, 30 Days a Night's the one to watch. However, if you like horror movies at all and comics, this is a guaranteed recommend.
I can't agree more. So I think we have this, thumbs up, thumbs down review system. Are we in the quarters? Where would you guys put this one?
I'd solidly put this one at a, I'm going to go thumbs up. I think, we're talking there again. I'm going to go back to my original point. We're talking about so few vampire movies. If there's, this is a movie that you could redo. If you added a couple extra scenes, would be absolutely phenomenal. I think it holds up well. And I think if you wanted to be scared and you wanted to be surprised and be like, it's another, and then be like, holy crap. You're going to get that in this movie.
Yeah, horror movies are my thing, and this is a good horror movie, and the fact that it's based on a comic is tertiary to me enjoying it. I would say that's a definite thumbs up for me.
Yeah, I believe this is a good horror movie in the sense of that it's not all gore. There are a lot of those horror movies that it's just gore for gore's sake, but it does have a ton of gore. But I think it's an appropriate level for what it's doing. Like that blood out on the ice, the snow, those shots are just spectacular. It's amazing. I would probably give it 3/4 of a thumbs up just because horror is not my genre. But it was still a good watch. Like I said, good $5. So before we leave today, Jeremy, what are you working on now?
Thankfully, it's a little slow for everything but the podcast. We're still always Retrovaniacs is always doing 2 regular episodes and 3 bonus episodes a month if you would join our Patreon. But aside from that, my band Subtastics, which you can find at subtastics.bandcamp.com, is writing new songs to go back to the studio early this fall. So I'm doing a lot of songwriting along with this.
Nice. And Fergel, what are you up to?
So we're just prepping up we've got Monroe Pop Fest coming up. Obviously we're doing some amazing things. Our movie nights are kicking back out, and we're just bringing on great new mix and great new materials. I think the biggest thing we're excited for is just some of the partnerships we've been creating. We've started adding some really, really custom commissioned statues, and we're really proud of that. Some wood pieces, some statues, and things of that nature. And again, just pretty excited about we've got a new website that we're bringing online. Our subscription service is actually starting up in the next week or two, and we are literally just got invited into our Warhammer 4000. So that's going to be we're going to be kind of working on some expertise in that area and adding that piece into our store during those game nights.
That's a lot on your plate. I'm just
yes,
working.
It is.
I'm just working on a Neil Gaiman Sandman inspired storage and wall unit. You guys have seen some of the pieces that have gone out for that, some of the artwork. I think it's coming together nice. I've probably got 3 more weeks left on that piece. But it should be done pretty soon, hopefully. So if you guys like the pod, like what you've heard, you like the pod, share it, review it. It's the only way this pod gets out there. So like I said, share with your friends. And if you don't like it, then just don't tell us about it.
Or tell people you don't like. That's fine. Just share the news somehow.
That's true. You can tell people, you just don't tell people you don't like it. Just tell them they'll start listening to it. They'll make their own opinion.
I agree. But I think we like it because it's amazing. And I think everyone would like it because movies
If you enjoyed the show, please give us a review and share with your friends. If you want to drop us a note, tell us where we were wrong, or give us a movie suggestion, visit us at movie-smash.com.